All right, Roshbaj, Kunbihir Khatin. Welcome to Zahra Institute's annual lecture 2026. I'm Sharina Sharani, Program and Outreach Director for the Institute. Happy to be here with you all as we gather together to learn more about the cultural developments that shaped Kurdish identity in the 19th century. But before we begin today's lecture, let me say a few words about Zahra Institute's programs. In addition to our graduate programs in Kurdish studies and critical Muslim studies, we offer beginning through advanced language instruction in Kurmanji and Sorani through our Kurdish Language Institute. We also host an online speaker series that brings together scholars, artists, students from all around the world. Recent highlights of the series have included conversations with Mamusta Omar Sheikh Mus about Kurdish politics and a poetry reading and a discussion with award-winning poet Hajar Baban. And next month, we are looking forward to a panel in the Critical Muslim Studies series about Muslim chaplaincy and the U.S. today. You can find recordings of many of our previous guest lectures and presentations on Zahra Institute's YouTube channel and Facebook page. After the event, don't forget to stop by the front table. There you'll find flyer detailing the remainder of the speaker series program for this academic year, and you'll also find brochures that you can pick up describing our academic programs. And we also have t-shirts for sale.
I see we have some faculty members here. I see Matthew, Mustafa Durmaz, and some board members and other ZI affiliated folks. I want to thank everyone and the guests who are first timers. We are very happy to see you here today. Our speaker is Professor Metin Atmaca, who is Professor of History at the Social Sciences University of Ankara and visiting professor at the Center for Kurdish Studies at the University of Exeter. He is currently collaborating with the Jin Center in Süleymaniye on Preservation and Digitization Initiative, an initiative supported by the British Library. Metin Atmaca is also the founder and editor-in-chief of the multi-volume Encyclopedia of the Kurds. His keynote lecture will explore the cultural and political forces that shaped Kurdish identity in the 19th century. If you hear about Kurdish identity, history of Kurds, Kurdish nationalism, it is predominantly it is about 20th century. So this is an earlier episode of the formation of Kurdish identity, and it's going to be very interesting. Different cast of characters and processes will be at play. So I'm looking forward to hearing the lecture. Last but not least, Professor Atmaca is also a coordinator of our Kurdish Studies program. So his advice and guidance has been part of the Institute as well. He's going to speak on the cultural foundations of Kurdish identity in the 19th century, as you can see from the banner here. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and Mamusta Metin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for coming. I'm hoping that I will be able to entertain you with such a dull and boring topic for most of you maybe. What to do with the 19th century, as earlier Harun was asking. I mean, why not something more modern? So I will try to, we historians don't like to connect the past too much with the present and the future, but then hopefully you will yourself try to find these roots of today's, conflicts in Kurdistan and the Middle East related to the past. I'd like to start with some of the questions to you as icebreaker to see what you make of the identity culture. What does it make you as you? What is that shapes your identity? Through what? Anyone? Yes?
Language.
Great. Language is a good starter. And anything else? How do you define yourself, especially most of you since live in this country as immigrants? Location, so the space, geography, your land is part of it. and so on and on.
Culture.
Culture is, of course, those as part of the culture, so we'll be focusing on what other elements are shaping the the cultural identity of the period. I wanted to trace it further back to early 19th century to show that actually identity formation is not something only being done in the 20th century, as most of theologians of the nationalism have been discussing, but trace it further back. But I'm not going to get you into too much the theory too. Just to give you some glimpses, I'm not going to be able to provide you all the elements. Instead, I choose some of them, and hopefully when I expand it further into a book, maybe you will be able to read it there, what I'm trying to do here. I'd like to start with the background of the 19th century. How did we come to 19th century? What happened before 19th century that brought us to 19, not today yet? Probably, I wish I would give you a nicer map to just show you what the boundaries and borderlands mean. But then this one, I didn't want to show you something in Ottoman or in Persian, but instead something in English of the period. It may not be very clear, but at least it will give you some sense of what the Ottoman was during that period, especially for the Asian part. And more specifically, where I will be focusing on, is the borderland regions, especially southern part of Kurdistan, as we call it in historical study. More specifically, focusing on Süleymani here, and also partially on Senendesh or Senne of today's. So both will make much of the lecture that we will be talking about. But before ahead, I wanted to just give you a background how these borders were made into 19th century. The story starts in early 16th century when Ottomans decide to get rid of the Safavid elements inside of Anatolia, and a man would emerge during that period called Idris Bitlisi, who was a very well-known Kurdish scholar of the period, decides to go to Istanbul in 1508, and then later on he goes again. He kind of becomes actually the architect of the policies that the Ottomans would come up with in terms of making the borderlands. So in some sense, I call him as the best Middle Eastern expert of the period, because he was an actually advisor in pre-Safavid dynasties in Iran, Akkoyunlus, and later on he would become an advisor during the Safavid period, and then he would move to Istanbul, and then even then he was not satisfied. He ends up in Memluk Cairo too. So he is just going around and meanwhile producing, but at the same time actually coming up with some concrete policies that would remain and that would shape the region till today. Although we still have problems, of course, but that wasn't, we cannot blame him for it. Anyway, the Ottomans decides to move further east and then takes over much of the Kurdistan. Actually, during the 16th century, much of Kurdistan was part of Ottoman Empire. But then the Safavids don't stop there. So, I think it's not working, but it's better not to have it. So, several successive wars take place on these lands that would shape the future of Kurdistan in the 19th century, even into 20th century. One of the major of them was, of course, 1514, the War of Chaldiran, that took place in further north around here. And then another war would take place in around Baghdad in 1534. And then several treaties would be taking place too, like in 1555 and Amasya Treaty, that would shape actually much of the policies of Ottomans and Iranians to the tourism region. By 1639, a last war would take place 1610, 20, 29, and then finally by 1639, a final treaty would take place, which would be kind of like a iteration of the 1555 treaty. So each and every time a war took place, actually Ottomans and Iran would come back to the same point. Not much loss, not much war. But who would be the losers in between these two empires was mostly the local people in these regions on both sides of the Zagros Mountains, as well as further north. So the policy would keep coming back actually into 19th century. That if Kurdistan should be part of Ottomans or it should be part of the Iranians, both would keep reclaiming for the next century, several centuries actually, into 20th century. I could say that these conflicts would remain in place until 1927, when finally modern successive states of modern Turkey as well as the modern Iran would decide to have a collaboration against the local people, reshaping the borders for the final time, and then striking a deal and remain as it is. But then the borders between Iraq and Iran wouldn't remain there. It would still become part of the conflict going into the 21st century till today. I mean, these days you have been hearing about again how the population on both sides should be part of the current war or not, and how should they collaborate with, the U.S. forces and so on. But that's not the question that we are going to get in. I want to focus more on 19th century, and I want to focus on a small region and give you a micro-historical perspective of that region to see how people actually transformed throughout that century and through these policies that would take place. First and foremost, through the empires, and then through local rulers, and then poets, Sufis, and so on and on. I mean, there are several others, but then I will try to limit as much as I can with with certain personalities. Although the background that I provided was mostly, just giving an imperial perspective, whatever the policies these people had in place in Kurdistan, there would be a response by the local leaders to them. So let's say if Mahmud II of the period, who was the ruler of Ottoman Empire in early 19th century, and Fath Ali Shah of Iran, back then was called Qajar Iran, and not Safavids anymore, in early 19th century, both would try to reshape the region through their own policies, through their own, backing up of their own candidates. Let's say if there were two brothers among a certain emirate family, one would support the one, the other one support against the other. So even the families would be divided among two empires. But nevertheless, it wasn't their, let's say, courtly bureaucrats that were coming to the region. It was the Kurds themselves who reshaping the region. I mean, many of the imperial historians, when they see such policies, they just call the local Kurdish leaders as useful tools. But here, actually, they are the one who reshaping the regional policies too, through their actions, through their support from tribal confederations, through, you name it, through a variety of things. I will show you a couple of images to show how they were also contributing to imperial policies through their own actions. But we shouldn't just throw it into the garbage saying that, the imperialists were always, having their own interests on the ground and trying to reshape the region through their own policies. Nothing beyond that. that's not true. I mean, that means that you are giving agency only to the imperial leaders, not the locals, and you are not trying to understand, you're just trying to give a simple story of it. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I've noticed, I don't know much about this period, but I've just noticed like a similarity in a lot of the, European and the Ottoman fashion as far as like the way the leaders are portrayed. I'm kind of wondering, is like, are they getting that from the Ottomans, or are they, where?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I mean, he has several other drawings, Mahmud II. He has the traditional government, but by 1826 and on, he comes up with some reforms, and as part of the reforms, he also, the dressing would be reformed too. So it's not the modern Turkey that came up with reformation of the clothing and other stuff. It starts a century before. But these reforms would be applied to Kurdistan too. One part of the reforms was actually centralization, which would come after mid-19th century, not before ahead, but still you have the remnants of this centralization that we will be talking about. But it's not only the leaders that are having their portrait being drawn, but you also have some Kurdish leaders who have their portraits being produced too. Here I'd like to show you a huge, panorama of a wall drawing, which is not there anymore. It was produced in early 19th century in the palace of Feth Ali Shah. Here it's a procession of a Nowruz celebration. Everyone comes together. I mean, I could have shown you only actually small piece of it and you wouldn't be able to figure out what that meant. But instead, I wanted to show you a much bigger panorama to show what kind of identity policy was in place during that period. First through the imperial policies, but also the local leaders themselves too, who were contributing to that formation too. Here you have, first and foremost, the Shah himself in the center, trying to show himself as the center of the world. That was, the shadow of God on earth, so on and on. You name it, whatever the propaganda he was using to show his power, which wasn't that much truth. I mean, they were not that powerful actually compared to European empires, even the Ottomans. But these people are not just here for celebrating something. They are coming here as part of a policy and politics too. And it's not only the dignitaries from in the empire, it's also people coming from outside and reshaping the empire's policies themselves too. Some of them are British here. I mean, I don't want to give names just to keep your mind busy, but really important figures during that period coming to Qajar Empire to make sure that the Iranian lands were kind of part of their policies as part of the reshaping of India. Brits, were getting more and more stronger in Indian subcontinent, and any lands between Europe, Mediterranean, towards India for them was important to secure, to make sure that it was, under somehow their policy. That includes Kurdistan too. I'm not going to get into detail, leave it for another discussion, but then imperial policies were not only belong to Ottoman and Iranians. Later on, Russians and Brits would come into the picture too, and they would be also, role player in terms of identity making in Middle East in general, but more specifically in Kurdistan. By 20th century, actually, Britain would occupy Kurdistan directly and rule the lands. I mean, imagine, starting from early 19th century with these people. So you have the Brits, you have the French ambassadors and dignitaries, you have Ottomans right here, several of them, and you have some of the Kurdish dignitaries too. from Ottoman Empire as well as from the Persian Empire too. But they are not standing by their own patrons. I mean, for example, one of them is Baban Abdurrahman Pasha is right here. He's standing with actually Iranian dignitaries, not their, de jure rulers, the Ottomans. Same here is the leader of the Iranian Kurdistan. Today we still call Iranian Kurdistan. Back then it was called Erdelan. So the ruler of Erdelan was standing on the other side. And they were not with each other too. But then this is a picture actually shows how the policy, especially towards Kurdistan and other regions would involve in Iranian politics. I mean, would be part of Iranian politics. They would not be, excommunicated, or they would be part of the policy making, or how to say, the politics making. And the Ottomans were there actually for the sake of Abdurrahman Pasha. Why? Because somehow the Iranians were dominating in Ottoman Kurdistan, the other side of the Kurdistan, through him. And to prevent that, Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II that you saw sent an envoy to the Iranian court asking, to stop infiltrating or, interfering. Whereas Abdurrahman Pasha was there actually to save his son, because his son was a political hostage in that palace, in that court. So imagine that. He was part of an Ottoman Empire, but at the same time, the Iranians were claiming that he was part of their polity and court too. And their kids would grow up with the Shah's kid, and they would learn the language and the culture. And Iranian culture would be part of actually their identity making too. It wasn't something alien. In fact, throughout the centuries, you see that the Ottoman Kurdistan, especially the southern part, the Sulaimani region, would be formed, their identity would be influenced more by Iranian culture than the Ottoman, Turkish, or even Arab culture. So it's really interesting. I mean, for centuries you remain as part of the Ottoman Empire, but you don't even speak their language. For example, Abdurrahman Pasha's letters to Ottoman Sultan that I came across were not written in Ottoman Turkish. They were written in Persian. Or some of them would even write in Kurdish in mid-19th century Bahdinani emirate, for example. So Turkish would become their part of their cultural identity actually close to mid-19th century, 30 years later after Abdurrahman Pasha would disappear from the scene, would die. And the Amanullah Khan, the leader of the Erdelan, the Iranian Kurdistan, was also there because he was married to Shah's daughter. So how much interwoven the Kurdish dynastical rulers with the Iranian dynasty, imagine that. They were, same, you can trace back to the 16th century, the writer of the Sharafnama, which is a really important book for the Kurdish history, produced by 1597, who was also emir of Bitlis, who was actually, who grew up in Iranian palace, who was even partially Shia, and later on would convert back to Sunnism. It's really interesting to see these relations. So the first map that I showed you may not have been very clear, but here you will see what kind of Kurdistan was in place by late 16th, early 17th century, which is based on Sharafname's account of the emirates. These are the emirates names: Dumbuli, Rojiki, Soran, Badinan, Baban, Erdelan, and these are their capitals mostly. Each one who would have their own capital. Some of the capitals and the cities were there. Later on, the Kurdish population would come in and would populate. Some of them actually were dominant by other minorities like Armenians, like Turkomans, like especially in the north. But then the leader would be Kurdish. Whereas it's interesting, Babans and Erdelans actually would come up with their own cities. They would build new cities with their own, taste, with their own identity, with their own, architectural taste. This one is Khosrow Palace in Semna, or today is called Sanandaj, which is still in place, used as a museum. This one is not the real palace that the Babanis came up with. Actually, it was built by late 19th century, called Saray, because it was built by the Ottomans. But the man in front of it, Ibrahim Pasha, whose statue was eradicated here, I think 6-7 years ago, he's the founder of the city. He came up with his own city by 1784. He named the city as Suleimani. There are a variety of accounts. Some of them say because of his son, some others say because he was very happy with the ruler of the Baghdad. He named it after, so on and on. But whatever the case was, both somehow created space for themselves that they would design according to their own taste. Of course, they would mix Iranian elements, Zandi elements, very little Ottoman elements. I mean, especially in Suleimani, in case, since Baban were part of the Ottomans for centuries, but we see very little Ottoman taste in design, whereas you see much more Iranian and Kurdish as well as Zandi taste in architecture. Now, I'm not going to get into the city. I want to still focus on the personalities. During that period, especially in case of the Suleimani, you have the emirs, the pashas, coming up with their own policies of, building the institutions like libraries, like madrasas, which I will talk more about it in the next slide. And they would try to attract poets, focusing on a certain linguistic peculiarity. Sorani later on would be called, even though they still call Kurdi. Sorani was not a dialect of actually written language till early 19th century. It was mostly Kurmanji used, starting from 16th century and on. You have several authors like Minay Jaziri, Ahmed Khani, Faqiyat Iran, Ali Taramaghi, you name it. I mean, there are several others. And Havrami, a language that was used by Sanandajis, by Erdelani, Iranian Kurds. Havrami was also a medium for the writing. They have several authors, I don't want to name it here now. But one of them was actually a woman, Mestura Erdelani or Kurdistani, and she was not only a poet but also a historian. she would write history of both Ottoman, Erdelanis and Babanis, their rulers' history. But of course, because of her family, she was coming from a very noble family. Her uncle, her cousin were also historians. Her father was an alim, so you name it. She wasn't coming from a simple family. And she becomes the second wife of actually the emir of Erdelan, Amanullah Khan, the man who was married to Shah's daughter, but later on he gets married with her, and they are so much in love in their poetry. You see that she writes poems for him, and he dies early, so she even becomes more sensitive about it. And later on, she is kind of like outcasted by the first wife. She leaves the city of Seleimani. She comes and settles down there. She meets the other poets like Nali, who was one of the first, probably second author, who also wrote in Sorani in Seleimani, who would be invited to the city by, again, Emir of Seleimani, Abdurrahman Pasha. They would write actually really harsh poets to each other. So I'd like to read one of them to show that what he was telling her and how she was responding is really interesting. He said to her name is Mastura. Mastura is allegedly a poet and a writer. What a charis and reprimand she bestowed upon me in my dream tonight. I have come, she stated, because I have complex. Is there a possibility? I am yours if you can solve my problem with a response. And then she hears about, really derogatory things from his poetry. She decides to respond to him, but when you look at this, how they are perceiving each other's identity too, you can figure it out. For example, when she responds to him, she says, Nali, you are a Jaf. Nali, you are a Jaf from Jaf tribe, which was one of the dominant tribal confederations in the region. What can I tell you? If you are a Jaf, you are just very simple. Obviously, you have no origin and are tribeless. Even if this is a tribe, who cares about that tribe? Therefore, you are rambling senselessness. Come forward if you are a man. Do you name empty talk joyousness? So you may be enjoying, but this is not even joyousness. What you are doing. If you are a man, come across me. So here maybe you can figure out how much identity is playing here. According to some historians, she was from, of course, Erdelan, and he was from Baban Emirates, and they had several wars among each other. And one of the last wars took place. Erdelanis killed some of the members of the Jaf tribe, so he was upset and he wanted to respond to her with a really harsh, word, and then she responds back to him. According to other people, he was in love with her. That's why he was expressively trying to, seduce her, so on and on. But imagine the period. This is the start of a language taking place, reshaping, the milieu of the land, which is not Kurmanji world, but it's now going to be a new world called Sorani, or Southern or Central Kurdistan, Kurdish world. And beyond that, you have other poets coming up and talking about the land's peculiarity, the independence of these emirs from these major empires, their old good days, you name it. I mean, especially once these emirates would be eradicated after 1850, the Ottomans and Iranians decide to centralize further the Kurdish regions. They would take away these rural or royal families and lords and leaders. And afterwards, these poets would react to such policies with, even more romanticizing of the period. So, beyond these, of course, they were Sufis, both. She was Qadri, and he was probably later on he would convert to Naqshbandi, because Naqshbandism would come later. Both regions would be dominated by Qadri Sufi order for a long time, for centuries, probably at least 2 to 3 centuries, starting from 16th century and on. But by early 19th century, a man called Khalid Shahrizori or Jafi would decide to travel to India because of his dissatisfaction with the Sufi orders in the region. He decides to go to Delhi to study Naqshbandism or Naqshbandiya Sufi order with a man called Ghulam Ali or Sheikh Shah Waliullah, Shah Abdullah Dehli or Dehlevi. And then in a year he gets his diploma, and then he comes back to the city by 1811. And at the period, Abdurrahman Pasha was the leader of the region. He decides to invite him from probably from Baghdad, I don't remember that part, or Kirkuk. He settles down in the city with a new Khanqa lodge. He built him actually a lodge which is still there, but probably it's not the original one, but it's been renovated. While the Qadris were still in place, so a new order would come and would take place in the city. This would create animosity with Qadri Sufis. They wouldn't like it. I mean, they were dominant for a long time in the city and in the region, and now a new competition would take place with a new order, Khalidis. So they would try to actually chase him out. It takes them around 10 years. By 1820, Khalid Shahrizori, he decides to leave for Baghdad and finally ends up in Damascus, lives there for a few more years, and then passes away in 1826 or 27. But his influence remains in place, becomes really influential, not only in Sulaimani, but in almost all of Ottoman Empire, as well as the Kurdish regions of the Iranian Empire too. So now you had two orders taking place. Till today, if you go Iranian Kurdistan, visit the city, especially northern Sorani speakers and some Kurmanji areas, you will find both Qadri and Naqshbandis, especially Qadris. They, through their not only Sufi identity, reshape the region, but also through their involvement in the politics too. For example, Naqshbandis, especially Khalid Shahrizori, would become actually a negotiator, a reliable and respected negotiator in times of war between Ottomans and especially the Kurdish leaders between Iran and Ottoman Empire. Many times the two emirates actually would fight with each other. Sometimes they would collaborate, sometimes fight. So I call them between hope and despair. It's not an easy relation. They wouldn't be able to get rid of each other, but they wouldn't also get along with each other too. So many times they would ask the Sufi leaders to become negotiator between them, writing letter to each other, who would be the katibs, the writers, of course, the Sufis, especially the sheikhs who were respected. So in that sense, they also reshape the political identity of the region by contributing through their, policies. Beyond that, I'm not going to get into detail of their interpretation of the religion, but a new kind of Sufi identity would take place in much of Kurdistan. And many of the Kurdish leaders, upcoming Kurdish leaders, after the removal of the emirs in 1850 by Ottomans and by Iranians by 1867, the power vacuum that were created in the place would be filled by these sheikhs. Sheikh Ubaidullah is one of them, really famous. Sheikh Said in 1925, Naqshbandi also. Sayyid Taha II, who would be one of the leaders of the resistance in World War I, or Sheikh Mahmoud Barzanji, although he was Qadri. Qadris would also be now new leaders of the region. So in 1810, 1815, 20s, they were still sheikhs only, not political leaders. But then, after the second half of the 19th century, they would now have a new role, a new identity, or a mixture of identity with religion. Political identity would come in. Just to show actually how much their identity was reshaped or shaped, politically and also culturally, I took a picture of inscription from both now our mosques, not lodges anymore, but they are still considered as two separate mosques. The Qadri mosque, because many of the sheikhs from Qadri are buried there, and also Naqshbandiya. This one is for Naqshbandiya. Here, I don't know, some of you probably read Sorani. You will see that they are making reference to Baban emirs as builders. Here is the emir that took power after 1813, Mahmud Baban, the son of Abdurrahman Pasha, whereas here his grandfather Ibrahim Pasha, who you saw the structure in front of the palace. And not only that, they are making reference to the past, they also making reference to the modern time too. Here you will find Jalal Talabani's name even as the president of modern Iraq, as the renovator of, and protector and patron of the mosque, because his great parents were Qadri too. Talabani family were really well known in Kirkuk especially. Whereas here there is no mention of him. It's just a reference to Harim Kurdistan, probably in reference to Barzani family. They were Naqshbandis because. So here, just a reference. To give it to you how much the political identity becomes their cultural identity. It reshapes it, and how much they contribute to Kurdish identity through their Sufi identities too. It amalgamates. You have imperial identity coming in place too. At the beginning, maybe I didn't elaborate on it, but to be considered as legitimate, they would fight with each other, the brothers or the uncles, you name it, to take over the power. But then to make sure that they are the most legitimate leaders, they would also seek help of the Sultan and the Shah too. So they would play with the politics of the empires for their own, sometimes, political end. Getting a letter from the Sultan was one of the part of that, shaping the political identity, or even a khilat, a robe, or a sword, a gift. All those would play actually in the local politics of the period. I want to end up here, actually before going to that poetry, I just want to read one of the poems that Khalid Shehrazuri also, because they are not only sheikhs, they are also poets too. Almost all the poets are coming from a Sufi background. I mean, where they get their education? From these madrasas. I mean, I cannot elaborate here how much madrasas play a big role in terms of reshaping the region, but schooling was in the hands of these Sufis too. So most of the education would be given to these children through these Sufi lodges, as well as the madrasas they built and the networks they expanded over, Kurdistan as well as the rest of the empire too. But just again to show how much the Sufi identity became part of the local identity, and how much they consider the locality, the geography as part of their identity. I just wanted to read a poem by Maulana Khalid Shehrazuri. He says, "My heart's blood is coming out of my eyes like the stream of Bakrajur and Sarchinar." These are two rivers in Slimani, which both spring into two streams. Tell me, Khalid, if you are not passionate and crazy, where did you come from? What are you doing in Kabul and Ghazna and in the land of India and Kandahar, where he, wanders around, try to rediscover himself and comes back with a new idea and identity. So, as a goodbye and as a closing remark, I want to just give one of the three important poets of the, they called Sekuche Sorani, the three pillars of Sorani language, Salem and Nali, Yusufid and Kurdi. So at the end, when he leaves the city, he remembers the past with, farewell. He says, "Goodbye, O land of Bagan, goodbye, goodbye, O truthful people, goodbye. The Ottomans are taking me by force. Goodbye, O Shah of excellent people, goodbye." Thank you, and
Wait, where is he going? Where are they taking him?
Good question.
I was wondering.
This is a period. Nali goes to exile. Most of them, they end up in exile actually, especially in Istanbul. Imagine Nali is buried in Istanbul actually. Haji Kadri Koyi, later on, he is also one of the well-known poets. He also ends up in Istanbul. When they end up in Istanbul, they come across actually the Kurmanji-speaking intellectuals, and they rediscover themselves through new texts. Memuzin, for example, by Haji Kadri Koyi, he becomes really attached to it, and he even teaches the text to children of one of the emirs in exile, to Bedr Khanis. And later on, the children of Bedr Khanis would publish in their newspaper that would be, published by 1898 in Cairo. So the evolving formation of identity continues. I mean, I cannot go on and on and on, but there are just so many elements in it, and so many intellectuals start to chip in terms of reshaping the identity into 20th century. So exile, actually, one of good colleague, she wrote her thesis on the subject of exile in Sorani literature. So it's very important. It becomes part of identity making. I mean, they are away from their homeland, but they are remembering with some glimpses in their minds, whatever it is. I mean, probably Baban rule wasn't that great, but then for them it was something that they could yearn for it, away from it. Sometimes some of them would, for example, Salim was in correspondence with Nali when Nali was in Damascus and later in Istanbul. He would keep asking if there is any way he could come back one day to his land and to see again, as good old days of the Baban emirs and so on. So you have this identity reforming during the exile period too, through intellectuals and poets.
The emirs creates a political vacuum, and then kind of corresponding to that transformation is the rise of Sufism as shuyukh, Sufi leaders as also political actors. And that intersection is interesting. I wonder if the role played by Mevlana Khalid Shahrazuri is a byproduct of that moment. How much of it, let me put it this way, how much of his political activism emanates from his particular reading of Naqshbandi, culture? How much of it is a product of necessity out of, of responding to the political vacuum that was created by the departure of the emirs or, their diminishing
By his
role?
disciples or by him? Because
My timeline might not be accurate,
yeah.
but you got the question. I think the
it's a
transition,
very-
is it really personal on the part of him? It's something that his agency generates this type of, politically active Sufism, or is it the context more explanatory for that?
Yeah, there have been studies trying to explore how much his political activism was reshaped by his visit to India by some retired scholars like Hamid Algar. He tried to elaborate on that he, in his prayer he mentions of the European, I would say, infidels, but then you still don't have the Europeans in place yet compared to, I'm comparing with India, of course. In India, when he was in Delhi was recently occupied just a couple of years ago before his arrival by the Brits. Direct rule was in place. So he, although the historians of, Sufism in India, they say that his teacher wasn't that much reactive at the time, but then he at least experienced. He was able to compare and contrast with the Ottomans. And Napoleon was already in the Middle East by 1798, so he definitely was aware of the European penetration into Middle East, but not as much as the Brits penetrated in India. So he definitely had some reaction to this change and transformation. And at the same time, the Ottomans were also transforming too, modernization. So as one of the colleagues behind asked why the Sultan is dressing like a European, because that is a time, it was by the end of his lifetime that he saw centralization and reforms taking place in Europe too. I mean, in Ottoman Empire, and same time you have Muhammad Ali Pasha from Egypt also moving into the empire with a new modern state, created army. So he is tasting the modernization or witnessing, but not in full context. In that sense, he definitely politicized. Besides that, the local politics transformed him too. He became part of political conflict between two Sufi orders, his as well as his students and the students of Qadiriyya. And beyond that, Iran was also part of that politics making. So he experienced several occupations of the city while he was there for several years. Babans are playing politics with Iranians, with locals, with emirs in Kirkuk, in Baghdad, you name it. I mean, so there is a lot going on, and the Brits are just arriving by 1908. So some of the Brits that you saw there, Malcolm, he arrives to Baghdad by I think 1808. So he's the first or maybe second, I don't remember, of the East India Company representative, whereas the man after him comes to Baghdad as the British East India Company's representative, becomes a friend of Abdurrahman Pasha. He even visits Suleimani by 1820 when his son was ruling, and he writes like a 2-volume account of the region. You know, I have been doing research in British Library, thousands of correspondence about the region, about the economy, about the politics, you name it. So what I'm hoping to elaborate in my work is that how by starting from 1810 and on, the Brits come in, they produce a knowledge that would be basis of the future of British colonialism by 20th century. The man who becomes friend writes a very sympathetic account of the Kurds, and for decades, blind I was reading actually as a sympathetic account, but then once I got into more detail of the archives, I realized that he was actually producing this knowledge for, it was an agent, he was an agent of his own empire, so he was producing the knowledge for his own empire. That also would shape the identity too. Over the century, the British policy in place would, transform it. By 1920, when Mahmud Barzanji becomes the king of Kurdistan, he declares himself, he starts negotiating with the Brits as to stay in place, but each time he would also, come across them as a conflict that they wouldn't allow him to become fully, in place. So there's a famous saying about him, for example. He goes to visit one of the British doctors in Baghdad. His doctor in 1930s or 40s, after he retires, forced retirement. I think one of in his body there is a bullet that remained in his body for decades when he was fighting against the Brits, and when the doctor asked him if he should remove it, he says, I don't think you should remove it, because it's like the British, if you take it out, it will kill me. But at the same time, I have to know how to live with it too. So he kind of summarizes the British identity making in place in Kurdistan in 20th century. But it becomes like a century of the formation through the colonial, colonial policy. But it's part of another talk maybe. Any other question? Yeah.
So you described the rise of Khalidiyya in Slemani and how it happened quite quickly. It took off, as a popular movement.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you could say more about the content of that refreshed, revitalized version of Naqshbandiyya, and what was about it that so attracted a Kurdish population on a popular level?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the way that he formed the network actually that became very influential, became really fast spreading network. Qadiriyya was in place for centuries, and the way they were organized was not allowing really big expansion beyond Kurdistan or other places. Although there are Qadiriyya in other places, but it's not through Kurdish scholars, but rather through centuries in North Africa, in other places. In a few places you have the Kurdish influence. Whereas Naqshbandiyya, when it came in Kurdistan, it was very vigorous, and of course he was very energetic, and he decided to come up with a networking that didn't need family lineage like in Qadiriyya. There you have the sheikh, and he passes away, his son or his son-in-law takes place, and so on and so on, in the same place. Whereas here, as the way that he went through a really fast-paced education, he also did the same with his own students. In a short period, he had raised thousands of students and sent them over different parts of the empire. By 1850, much of the lodges in Istanbul would be actually part of the Khalidiyya network. Caucasia, same Caucasus, and later on would be part of the resistance against the Russian occupation. In the Middle East too, Syria, for a long time, till recently, Naqshbandiya was part of the religious milieu in the place. So, but in terms of the, text and other things, it's not easy at the moment to elaborate on it. What kind of text he used. He has his own writings, letters, how to say, his communication with his students and the murids, his disciples, that were published later on, shows that how vigorous he was in terms of the expansion and connection. And also, of course, there are ways of keeping Sheikh's image in your mind, or the way the zikr they developed. It was a more quiet inner zikr compared to Qadiriyya, which was out loud and outer more. There are ways and styles that he transforms and develops the Sufism in Kurdistan, and he becomes more inclusive too. Later on, you will have the Arab students coming in, Caucasian students. Till today, you have Turkish students still going to Khalidiyya madrasas, learning the teachings and so on. So it allows it to expand further, because it's horizontal, it's not, it's more, not related to family lineages, but rather the lineage goes through the teacher and student and so on and on. Yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for excellent lecture. In this poem, Vek Asiri Turkmen, I just wonder what did Kurdish people call Ottoman and Sasanis, like a Turkmen or Ottoman?
They would call Rumi in much of Kurdistan till today. Rum, Askeri Rumi, for example, maybe you have heard of in songs. Or when someone married to a Turkish, he said he's married to a Rumi. I don't know. Till today it's been used. But here, probably because of the rhyme, he uses Turkmen. But the reference is to the Ottomans. Not local Turkmens in the place that they were the one who forced him out, but instead it was the Rumis, the Ottomans. You were saying?
Just like he's from Erzurum.
Yeah, like Erzurum, in the land of Rooms, or even Urumiyye, in further east. That's where the Iranian Kurdistan starts, but for Iranians it's very west, so it's the land of the Rum, Urumiyye. So it's...
How about Persians? What they call
the Persian Ajam, they would call them Ajam, not word Iranian. Sometimes Fars, they would call them Fars, depending on where they were referring to, because the leaders were actually Turkic. So for them, they were Azeri. So sometimes they would call them as Ajam, but depends on where. If it's Persian, Isfahan, Shiraz, these lands, they would call them Fars, for example, depending. Tajik is reference to the Persians too, actually, sometimes.
What exactly means Rumi?
Where?
For Turkish people, when they call Roman.
For the Kurds or for the Turks?
Turks.
for the Turks,
What's the meaning?
if you are a tribal or if you are a nomadic Turk, you wouldn't be called Rumi. They would refer to the Ottomans as Rumis.
So what's the meaning of the
Rum means Romans, in reference to the Ottomans who took over actually the Roman Empire.
so copy of the Roman?
Yeah, I mean, from very early on, Ottomans were in the idea of taking over the Roman Empire and actually emulating their system, taxation system, political system, architecture. I mean, the Ottoman architecture is very much, copied from the Roman, Eastern Roman Empire, of course, which we call Byzantinians.
Isn't one of the titles of the Ottoman Sultan the Ashraf of Rome?
Yeah, I mean, the Kaiser of Rome, for example, he would call himself if you read the laqab, the head of the letters of Sultan Suleiman, he makes reference to Rome of, Kaiser of Rome, and Sultan of Kurdistan, for example, they would call, because this is the time that he incorporates all Kurdistan into Ottoman Empire by 1830s, when he takes over the southern part, where I was talking about. It wasn't included by 1514 when the first war was waged on Safavids, but later, 20 years later, would be incorporated. Yes.
I have a question. In the poem here it says, "Awake Asiri," yani, as a captive.
Yes.
Ottomans are taking me by force. So after they are being exiled to Istanbul, just like Badr Khans were exiled as well. So they were not actually kept in a prison, right? So
No.
they were able to collaborate.
Yeah. They were.
So what's the nature of that captivity? I guess.
Mustafa was saying that immediately a vacuum took place, which is now disputed by historians a lot because it was a transitional period too. Probably took 15-20 years. Most of the Sufi leaders, political leaders, would be dominant by 1870s and 80s. In southern Kurdistan, in northern Kurdistan, Sheikh Ubaidullah by 1880s, Sheikh Ahmed Kakai by 1860s, and his son Sheikh Said, so on and on. So later on, because it took them more than probably 2 decades to decide how to resettle the Kurdish rulers that I showed many of them were not in place anymore in the map that I showed. There were some of the most important of them were in the southern Kurdistan, like Hakkari, like Botan, Soran, Baban, and so on. But the northern ones were already incorporated, the Bitlisis, the Bayazidis, the Pahlavis, those were kind of like already incorporated into Ottoman polity by late 18th century. So when they were taken away by 1850s, most of them were sent to really far away to first Girit, the Crete island of Greece today, Bedrkhanis. Some of them were sent to Albania, and later on, a few years later, they would be recalled to Istanbul because they sent so many petitions. Please, we are in, and they were not alone. 50, 60 people, the entourage, including some of their, teacher of their kids, like the poets, were with them too sometimes. They would witness their exile. So later on, the Ottomans decided to incorporate them into bureaucracy. They would be appointed to walis. For example, the last emir of Babans, Ahmed Pasha, first he was sent to Paris as part of an envoy, and he was sent because he was sick. I don't know, that's the description. He even he becomes friends of linguist, French linguist, and French linguist is very much interested in Southern Kurdish, and then he writes, an article based on his the knowledge he produced and he provides. And later on, he is appointed as the Wali of Yemen. Another one would be sent to, Libya as a leader. Some of them would be judges, because in the 19th century, most of the Kurdish notables were well educated, and they were incorporated into Ottoman polity. They learned Turkish, the second, third generation in the 19th century. And they knew how to rule, they ruled the land for a long time. Some of them would be even reappointed as the Kaymakam and Walis, the governors of their region or other regions, not specifically to their places. Because the land dispute was still in place between the Ottomans and these families. They would go to court, say that, okay, this land belongs to my family. Some of them were waqf. Waqfs were not easy to handle for Ottomans. Till today, waqf records are still in place. Even from the Middle Eastern countries, people come to Istanbul and Ankara, try to figure out if waqf was belonged to their families, if they could take it to the court, so on and on.
Yeah. Another Süleyman Nazik, he was from Diyarbakir, was the governor of Musul. My question is about, although they are very well educated, Mestura, the poet Mestura, when she was writing to Naib, they are still, their mentality is tribal. It is not Mestura.
Mestura, yeah.
She belittles him as because of his tribe.
It is mentality.
Yes, the Kurdishness identity of Kurdish is not still. It is a long way to shape, I think, at that time.
Yeah, I didn't get much into the tribal identity too.
Yeah.
That one is also part of the identity formation. So I'm trying to figure out how, with different stages and different compartments, how the identity was shaped. What I'm refuting with other historians that it wasn't single tribal identity. I'm trying to show that you have different stages and different dimension of identity making in early 19th century.
Yeah.
So tribalism is one part, probably 1/5 of it. I don't know. I cannot elaborate on it. But then again, not for belittling or not for making a dominant paradigm too. It is part of it. But then how much? The poetry shows partially. Mestre is showing herself, as you said, as a noble woman, whereas trying to say that you are not even a tribesman. You are just someone really,
Yes, still, some of our colleagues, they was born in the city. They say, and they call them as a Bajari and and Gundi.
You're right. Yeah. Even the people who were were not part of the tribe were Gundi or Kurmanj or Goran, depending on where you are looking from. You had a huge chunk of population had nothing to do with tribes too, which would be actually belittled by the tribesmen. Today most of them are city people, city dwellers, and they probably ended up in cities earlier than the tribesmen too, especially in Eastern Kurdistan.
I just an anecdote to your question about Naqshbandiya Khalidiyya and Martin von Brunsen. He said when I was attended at leftist meeting, protest meeting in Ankara in 70s, and I just approached somebody. I said, I just came from Jazeera. And he said, who is old Sheikh? With a deep respect, and he's surprised. He said, you are leftist, you are organizing, a militant protest to the government, but still you care about the health of the Sheikh. Yeah, then he said, I understand his book of his name, his book's name is as well now, Agha Sheikh and State.
Yeah.
And he said, then I want to understand how the impact of Naqshbandi is on the Kurdish society.
Yeah, I mean, especially for the time that he was doing research, it was even more dominant. Today, it's not easy to say that. Probably back then, let's say, if half of the population was still under influence of a Sufi order, today it's not even probably 10-20%, especially for northern Kurdistan. So, but again, it shows how much the Sufis were also in identity making too. I mean, even in late 20th century.
All right, with that, I think we are going to close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.